Well, hello and welcome to the challenges of coming alongside a troubled student. My name's Adrienne Wood and I'm a trained high school teacher. I've taught in high schools for many, many years, and the high schools I choose to teach in are multicultural, low socioeconomic demographic. And along with that generally comes a lot of challenging behaviours, which is great because that's my key area of interest as a teacher. But after a time of teaching, I decided I was really fascinated and wanted to do a little bit of research into this area. So a lot of what I'm sharing today comes out of research I've done around the challenges of coming alongside a troubled student. So the question I ask myself is, are we successfully managing troubled students' needs? And I wondered, should we be focusing on managing their behaviour or on their emotional health and well-being? It's not a question that often gets asked. So I'll start by defining what is a troubled student. According to my research, I defined a troubled student as disengaged with learning, behaviourally challenging, and that's a raft of different behaviours that you'll see under that, underachieving, high truancy rate. And alongside that, I found as I researched that there are a lot of complex learning needs, and I think we as teachers all understand that that goes hand in hand with the troubled student. I also found that they are overrepresented in low socioeconomic demographics, and in New Zealand they're overrepresented in our Pacific Island and Māori population. Internationally, in the research, they're also overrepresented in ethnic minority students. So if you look at what happens to troubled students when they leave school, it paints an interesting picture. Troubled students often leave school early with low or no school qualifications. They have low literacy and numeracy levels. And in adult life, they suffer from economic insecurity and poor life outcomes. Now, this is no surprise to New Zealand researchers. In fact, this specific group of learners has been researched, and enormous targeted government funding has been put into this specific demographic. There's a level of shame in us as a country. We are particularly poor in serving what's called the long tail of underachievement. If you look at the bell curve, it goes on with this specific demographic of students at the bottom end of our learners. So much has been poured in, but so little is giving a result. And I wondered why. Well, the question everybody has is, how do we improve outcomes for this vulnerable group? And almost all current initiatives largely target learning and behaviour. And you'll see the titles of the programs and interventions. They have words like learning or behaviour in their titles. But what if we looked first to their emotional well-being? So I searched in the literature and in what I could find out there for this approach to our more vulnerable learners. And I ended up asking the question, why are they troubled? Why are they coming to school with these behaviours? Why are they coming to us with so many problems? And I came across an enormous body of literature called attachment theory. Now, this has been around for decades and decades now, over half a century, and is increasingly looked to by those who are looking for answers. What I discovered is that students with a poor relational home environment lack a sense of belonging or connection with a caring adult, and that leads to poor emotional well-being. But students with a warm relational home environment generally experience positive emotional well-being, despite sometimes troubling circumstances. Now, this fascinated me. We can't, as teachers, change the circumstances that our kids come to us with. And yet, why do some children do well and others not? And this led me into this enormous body of literature called resilience literature, which I'll just briefly describe. So you might have two separate children, both who've experienced an adverse childhood experience. Let's say they've both suffered abuse in their childhood. And you take them both and follow them through to adult life. Now, what researchers found is for one of these students, they got through to adult life and they were experiencing optimal outcomes. They were economically stable, emotionally stable, and had good physical health. And yet the bulk of students who experienced adverse childhood experiences and a poor home relational environment in adult life were economically unstable, emotionally unstable, and had poor physical health. What was it, they asked, that had made the difference? Invariably, you can follow research paper after research paper in the thousands, and I have read a fair few, and they all seem to come to a similar conclusion. The continuous presence of a caring adult in that child's life makes all the difference between poor outcomes and good outcomes in later life. So that was really interesting. And it builds on attachment theory, which says to feel cared for and loved is our preeminent human need. You know, we used to think it was most important to have safety and security, our survival needs met, and then higher up the tier, it was our need for belonging and closeness. But increasingly it's becoming apparent that even above food, even above shelter, what is most urgent and most pressing and most catastrophic to us as human beings is not feeling cared for and not feeling loved. Troubled students lack emotional capital, which is created through a warm relational home environment. And that leads to a poor self-concept, a sense of alienation, a sense of school disconnectedness, and resistance to learning and school. Now we sort of say, why do they behave like this? We've got to think what's happening for them at home. Researchers look at things like how many thousand hours has this student experienced the warm, caring gaze of a parent, the smiles, the encouragement, the laughter, the playfulness, the grace for when they mess up and do something stupid and they're like, oh, well, let's clean it up together. Never mind, we can manage this together. A troubled student will have had hundreds, if not thousands, fewer hours of that sort of experience. And so often as teachers, people come to me and say, I work professionally with teachers, and they say, well, it's really unfair that this troubled student is taking 80% of my time and my other 29 students only get this. It's not. We need to understand fairness differently. If we look at how fair it is that those other 29 students got 10,000 hours and that student got 10, we've got to think about how can we redress this balance as a teacher. So attachment research shows us that a warm parent-child relationship creates children with better cognitive functioning. So we say, oh, well, that child's just brighter. Actually, so much of that is formed by their home environment. A healthy self-concept, good internal self-regulation. Now, schools, we rely on this. We rely on kids having good self-regulation. In the Neufeld Institute, we call that looking at both sides of the coin. We call it integrative functioning, be able to see on the one hand and on the other hand. So a child walking into class late gets that, that eye. Why are you late, Johnny? A child with good integrative functioning will go, oh no, I'm really scared, I'm late and I don't have a note and I've got no reason. But I know my teacher cares about me and I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to tell the truth and face the consequences of that. A child with poor self-regulation can't do the two hands. All they can do, on one hand and on the other, all they can do is see, oh my goodness, I'm in trouble. Loss of eye contact, I'm going to kick the rubbish bin, I'm going to storm out. What we call impulsive behaviour is that lack of regulation to look at both sides of the coin. And it's critical for surviving in the classroom. Attachment research also shows us that a distant or unpredictable parent-child relationship creates children who do not concentrate as well. They're more prone to ADHD. They fear failure. They do not seek help from adults. They don't trust adults. They're poorly prepared for tests and exams because why would you put your attention on something that is quite alarming and you don't have the warmth and support to go there? They give low priority to their studies. And they often display psychopathology and delinquency, a big word for all of that crazy stuff that we see in the classroom that is difficult to deal with. Now, the thing that excited me as I was wading my way through the literature was that I discovered a caring teacher can compensate for poor emotional well-being. We as teachers, we can't control what comes through our door. We can't control the kinds of students that we find in front of us, and we can't control their home environments. There's often a real sense of helplessness. What can I do? And it's actually that teachers come to me in workshops and professional development and say, I care, but I can't make a difference to all of this. The research shows this fascinating thing. Students who are already doing well do a little better with a caring teacher. They're doing okay, it pulls them up, and they tend to feel a whole lot better about that class and that teacher and that subject. But students who are troubled and doing poorly find their success dramatically improves if they believe their teacher cares about them. It is that niche demographic, your troubled student, what I called in my research your disaffected learner. That is the student who stands to benefit the most. It's an absolutely significant shift if they feel their teacher cares about them. This is exciting stuff as a teacher. I think I've gone the wrong way. So a caring teacher can compensate for poor emotional well-being. Here's a piece of research by Hamre and Pianta that found academic and behavioural outcomes of a warm teacher relationship are strongest among low socioeconomic status students who are underachieving ethnic minorities children. That is the group that stands to benefit the most. Another piece of research is done by a New Zealand researcher called John Hattie, and it's called a meta-analysis, where he took over 900 pieces of research done on teacher effectiveness, and he took the huge strands and he put them all against each other, and he concludes at the end of this enormous literature review that teachers' beliefs and commitments are the greatest influence on student achievement over which we have some control. That says something. That says we make a difference. We can make a difference, even though we only may have them under our door and in our classroom for an hour a day, or if you're an elementary teacher for a full day. So the problem is that not all teachers warm to troubled students. We warm more easily to those students who come to us with already a good relational capital. They know how to connect. They know how to be warm. It's our troubled students that give us much more of a problem. And there's a real decline in teacher-student connectedness in the shift from elementary to secondary school. It's noted in the literature, and I notice it myself as a high school teacher. Kids in primary school trust their teacher more, they warm to them more, they look to them and trust them more. There's a lot more guardedness and defendedness in high schools. Teachers actually naturally connect better with students who already have a strong relational home base. It's called the Matthew effect. And so it might be that, Amanda walks in the door and we say, "Hey Amanda, how was it going? How was your sports tournament in the weekend?" "Oh miss, it went really well, you should hear." And we chat and it's easy. Thomas walks in the door and we go, "Hi Thomas," get no eye contact, or like maybe kind of a grunt. The next interaction we have with Thomas might be, "Get your dirty feet off the table please, Thomas." "Thomas, I'm talking to you." And so what you see is happening is that those who already have a rich ability to connect with others get a richer and richer ability too, because we're connecting with them over and over, and our poor get poorer. It's from a verse in the Bible in the chapter of Matthew called "The rich get richer and the poor get poorer." It's just interesting to take this into account in our school environments when we're looking at our troubled learners. I've got a story I want to share here that came out of my interviews with teachers that I worked with. So there was a student, we'll call him Mark, who came into one of my teacher's classes, really troublesome, really reactive, really difficult to engage with. And her heart went out to him. She worked really hard to engage him, to connect with him. And slowly he began to warm up. And actually she said after a while we got on really well. Now this was a teacher who was already doing a whole lot right. She would come to class in terms of relationship. She'd come to class with cakes. She'd bake cakes and hand them out at the start of class. The school was in a very impoverished area and kids would not, they couldn't say no to it. They absolutely loved it. She'd noticed kids who didn't have a jacket or couldn't afford the school uniform, and she'd go out and she'd find one for them in the school lost property, buy them from the second-hand shop, and the kids knew they could go to her and ask for help when they needed it. Now, this particular student, as the year went on, became really easy for her to work with, and she enjoyed him and connected, and there was never a behavioural problem in her class. But the same student would walk out of her class into another teacher's class and create all sorts of problems. The way that he connected with his teachers was making all the difference. Now, one day he came to her and said, "Miss, I have to go before the board. I'm about to get expelled for something I did." And she goes, "What on earth happened?" He had thrown a chair at another teacher. And she said, "Well, of course I'll support you, but what on earth happened? How did this happen? Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, miss, we were in health and the teacher was talking about drug use and drug education. And she said, if you take weed, it shrinks your balls." And then she looked at me in front of the whole class and said, "Just like Mark over there." And you can imagine how any poorly regulated individual who doesn't have, on the other hand, is going to react really aggressively, and in his case, violently. He threw a chair and he was facing the possibility of expulsion, and we all know the outcomes of that, an entire lifetime of poor outcomes as a result of being pulled from the education system. It led me to beg the question, are they responsible for their behaviour, or are we? You've got one kid, 2 classes, his behaviour was like night and day, black and white. We know that child is struggling with his self-regulation. So whose problem is it that he is reacting in that way? It's a really important question, and it was one that led me to go on to look more closely in my research on how to help teachers connect better with their toughest customers. So I put together a research project that I'll tell you about. I used the Teachability Factor training, which is on the Neufeld Institute website, as an intervention with troubled students. So I went to a school that was multicultural and low socioeconomic demographic, and so there were already going to be a lot of behavioural issues in the school, as the literature defines. And I went to the school and said, who would like to work with me? I found 8 teachers, so the intervention was done with 8 classes. 4 of the classes had teachers who went through the Teachability Factor training, and 4 of them were control classes where their teachers didn't go through the training. The teachers were given 2 full days of training a week apart. All the students were surveyed before and after the intervention, and their disaffection levels were measured using something called the Engagement versus Disaffection Scale, EVSD. And intervention teachers were interviewed in depth afterwards. You can see there's a lot of data that came out of it. I'm just giving you a taste, but I'm going to summarize it for you, not put you through the pain of all those numbers. Or you might love numbers, but I found it very painful. I'm not a numbers person. I had to work out, did the intervention teachability factor succeed? So the quantitative findings were measured through the data that I collected, and then I also did qualitative findings through interviews. So my quantitative findings found that there was an overall reduction in disaffection in both the control and intervention groups. However, the fall was minimal in the control group, and it was significant in the intervention group, which kind of fits with my theory that the longer you get to know your teacher and the longer you get a chance to build up a relationship, it's going to warm up. However, the group that the teachers went through the teachability factor training, we found a statistically significant drop in disaffection in 2 factors that were measured. We measured 8 factors. These 2 were the ones that showed up. Emotional disaffection, which is all of that emotional stuff. I hate school. I hate learning, that kind of attitude, what we might call attitude as a teacher. And the other factor that showed up was active behavioural disaffection. That was the stuff they did. They were surveyed and asked, do you walk around the class while the teacher is talking? Do you throw paper? Do you swing on your chair? All of those sorts of things. There was a statistically significant drop in the group before and after the teachability factor training. And just to note, male participants showed a much greater drop than females, which I found also interesting. So the qualitative findings, this is where I interviewed in depth for the 4 teachers and asked them what they learned, what they discovered, what was different as a result of the training. So after the training, teachers reported to me seeing their troubled students with different eyes. And this is what shifted their heart towards those students. They learnt to recognize vulnerability when what they thought they were seeing was a really tough kid. They actually realized underneath it was a lot of vulnerability. They learnt to recognize defendedness. Behavior that comes out of defense is not always intentional. It's often, it's coming out of a real base survival instinct. And they learnt to recognize developmental immaturity. What we were talking about with the self-regulation. If a child is developmentally immature, they haven't got that yet by their teens, and yet we expect them to. They realized I'm asking something of them that they're not developmentally able to do yet, and so they compensated for that. And I want to share a story here with one teacher who talked to me in her interview. She had a student, we'll call him Chad, and Chad was one of those really difficult kids, one of those really troubled students who was really difficult to engage. And as a result of the intervention, she decided to really make more effort to engage with him rather than do that sort of a thing we do as teachers. 1 warning, 2 warning, 3 warnings, now you're out, because once the troubled student's out of the classroom, you can actually breathe and start to teach properly. Well, I know that's something that we're tempted to do at teachers at any rate, as teachers. Chad, she made good progress with him and they started to make a connection. Turns out this teacher, we'll call her Jane, was running a chess club, and Chad shuffled on up and asked to join. Quite unlikely. He was a big, troubled, difficult, challenging student, and here he was joining the chess club. But she took it in her stride, welcomed him in, he became part of the team. One day she took the whole group in the weekend to a chess tournament. And Chad came along, and at the end of the night, she was dropping all the kids home, and Chad was the last on her list. When she got to Chad's home, turned out he'd given her the wrong address. So she said, "Well, where do you live, Chad?" And he gave her another address, and she said he ended up taking me on a wild goose chase all over the back streets of Auckland, trying to find his house. Eventually, she stopped the car. She looked at him and said, "Chad, what's going on?" And Chad hesitated, and then he said, "It's just that, miss, I don't want to go home." Turns out it wasn't safe there. And she said, "This is a tough situation to be put in late at night alone with a student. I didn't know what I should do," but she'd done the teachability factor that had taught her to not be afraid of tears. And Chad started crying. He talked about his home environment and the tears just started flowing. And she said, "I just let it happen. I just let them come." And eventually he stopped crying. And he found his courage and he said, "Okay, this is my actual address, miss. You can drop me home now." Obviously, Jane had to work through the implications of the professional implications of reporting that situation. But what she commented on in the interview was that Chad walked back into her class the next week, a changed student. All the agitation had dropped, all of the pushback, all of the defiance. She said, "He's like a puppy dog. I'd ask him to, hand out the books, he'd hand out the books. She'd ask everyone to be quiet, and he'd go, 'Shush, shush, everyone quiet, listen to miss.'" She said he was just 100% different child, different kid. The entire year of learning panned out differently because of that moment. What happened? What had happened was that she'd seen him with different eyes. He was no longer this big, tough, scary, threatening, aggressive kid. He was just a kid in trouble. And she saw the vulnerability and she responded to it. So look, if you want to know more about my research, it's all there on my website under my tab called Teachers, and you can scroll down and click and find my dissertation. There's a full 3,000 word bibliography there for those of you who may want more referencing. But really, if I could summarize my research into one sentence, it would be: create a connection with your troubled students. I'm now handing over to the fabulous David McFall, and who could be better than he to introduce you to how he's done it in his school. His stories are inspiring, they're amazing. I love talking with David. I always come away on a high, and I think you will too. So welcome, David.